Our chapter of IJM works to raise awareness about the injustices in our world, how IJM is tackling them. We also fundraise for IJM and we pray for IJM's work. We're hosting this event because IJM Canada is a large advocate for supply chain reform within our borders. And so we wanted to delve a bit more into this topic to understand how modern slavery is tied to global supply chains and how we are to respond as consumers wanting to purchase ethically. Our speakers will be addressing these questions tonight. The former question will be tackled by Benedict Wray, who is speaking first, and the latter by Tara Porter. We want to make sure that there is room for discussion tonight as well. So after they have each presented for 30 minutes, they will each have individual Q&A time as well. You can send your questions to Q&A IJM throughout the evening. I don't think they're logged on yet, but they will be very, very shortly. And you can do that at any point in their presentations. Just make sure to specify which question is for which speaker. And two more things to mention, giveaways and a fun photo op. So first, we've got some stellar giveaways from a local fair trade business that our second speaker is from, Pokoloko in Ottawa. Everyone who has attended this Zoom will actually be entered in this draw, and the winners will be announced at the end of the night around 8:45 p.m. The first giveaway is a set of super handy eco mesh grocery bags for your produce. Super cool. They are machine washable, environmentally friendly, and super easy to use. And this one is paired with a box of 6 bamboo straws that come with a brush as well. They're reusable, compostable, and good for hot and cold drinks. And our second giveaway item is a beautiful Hesir towel, and it's handcrafted, artisan made. It is soft and durable and multi-purpose. So we will sign up everyone in this Zoom call for the giveaway and announce that towards the end of the night. And for everyone else, Pokoloko has actually generously offered a discount code for us all to use to get 15% off a purchase until March 31st. And so this code will be posted in the chat as well. And the last thing, a photo op. So some of you may have seen on your social media feeds today that today is actually Shine a Light on Slavery Day. And so it's started by the End It movement, who gets folks to draw a red X on their hand, standing in solidarity with the movement to end modern slavery. So during this event, find a pen, marker, or crayon. It doesn't even have to be red, but draw an X. And by the end of the night, we'll take like a screenshot of everyone putting up their hand. And I just think that would be a really cool thing to do collectively in this time when we're all distanced. So I have definitely done enough talking. So now I'm going to pass it off to Mary, someone from our exec team, who will give a formal introduction to Benedict Wray.
Thanks, Jenna. So yeah, hi guys, welcome so much. We welcome you to this event. I'm just going to introduce our first speaker, Benedict Wray. So Benedict Wray has an impressive array of experience around the world, to say the least. His practice is focused on international arbitration, legal disputes, and general commercial litigation, specifically in international law and business and human rights issues. Dr. Wray is a qualified barrister in both the UK and Canada and holds extensive knowledge in the legal systems of France and the United States. His experience in public law, public negligence, product liability, transnational corporate liability make him the perfect knowledgeable candidate as our first speaker. With his expertise in advising on corporate social responsibility and human rights due diligence issues for corporations around the world, he will be explaining the complexity of global supply chains, how they work, and how they relate to our everyday lives. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight, Benedict. We welcome you warmly. You will now have the ability to share your screen, so the floor is yours whenever you're ready. We'll also let you know when you have 5 minutes left so that you can proceed into the time of Q&A. So attendees, you are welcome to send Q&A questions to the Q&A IJM account, as Jenna mentioned throughout this presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mary. It's quite embarrassed after that introduction. Normally when I get introduced as a speaker, I'm usually preceded by people who have accomplishments much bigger than mine. But I'm quite humbled by the way you introduced me, so thank you very much. As that introduction made clear, I'm a lawyer. I also hold a PhD on business and human rights issues. And in my practice, I have a general litigation practice, but I also advise companies on business and human rights issues like modern slavery and kind of the various issues that are now being lumped under what's called ESG, or environment, social and governance issues. around supply chains, around disputes, and around kind of policy and compliance as well. And I've also worked on some international human rights cases. So I've sort of scratched the surface of, I still feel though that I've scratched the surface of this topic. I mean, I think as my presentation is going to make clear, it's an enormous, it's both an enormous problem and an enormous area to study. And it can feel quite daunting sometimes to wonder how on earth we can do anything to kind of do some good in this area. But there are concrete ways in which we can. And I'm going to kind of come to those a little bit longer. So are we able to display the slides? Super. Well, so that's just the introductory slides. Let's go straight to the first slide and we can kind of take it from there. So before we kind of come on to understanding what a supply chain is, I think it's helpful to kind of lay the groundwork on what a supply chain isn't. So I just got to put a diagram up here that shows kind of a more traditional business model, a kind of typical corporate group. And so in an equity ownership kind of corporate group like this, you might have at the top, very top of the kind of food chain before you get into public shareholders and things. If the shareholder is a public company, or kind of private shareholders if it's a private company, you might have a holding company that is basically just a vehicle to hold ownership in the various business streams that the corporate group has. And below that level, you generally have the operational companies, and those are what we usually think of when we use the term parent company. It tends to be the companies that have sort of typical operational oversight and control and kind of strategic direction for each of those business streams. So for example, if you take the food industry, a company like PepsiCo, well, PepsiCo has tons of brands. It has Pepsi, but it also has loads of other brands. I'm not pretending that this is a representation of PepsiCo in any way, shape or form, but it's common in groups like that, you know, the soft drinks stream will be under one operational unit, you know, food and confectionery will be under another, maybe other drinks are hived off to another. And so that's what I mean by the operational companies that are at that green level. And then under those, you'll have the subsidiaries. So the local companies or the smaller companies that do kind of any number of tasks within the group. So they might be incorporated again to sort of, if you've got a general operational company that's dealing with soft drinks, then you might have one for each brand of soft drinks under that. Or if this were a mining company, you might have a holding company at the top, then you might have an exploration stream, a mining stream, and a refining stream. And then the mining stream would have underneath it a subsidiary for each of the mines that they operate, for example. So that's sort of how a sort of traditional equity ownership model works in a corporate group. We go to the next slide. And that can kind of go transnational very easily. So here I've modified my diagram a little bit to show a slightly more complex scenario. So here you have where I've put that little red local sub. That's where that subsidiary might be based in a different jurisdiction to all of the other companies up the chain. So you might have a holding company incorporated in Canada, and you might have an operational company incorporated in Canada because all the management is here and everyone who's responsible for the kind of strategy and direction of the company is here. But then the project that you might be incorporating a local subsidiary for might be somewhere entirely different. So that would be your local subsidiary. Say, let's go with our mining company. You might incorporate a subsidiary in Africa or in South America. And for various reasons, often due to for tax reasons or liability reasons, you'll have a chain of intermediaries. So it's often not the case that the operational parent company necessarily owns those subsidiaries directly. There's often an offshore company in between or several. And this gets sort of more complex as we get into joint ventures and other things. But the kind of key feature of a group like this is that the ownership flows down from the top. It's like a pyramid. So you can see I've got my blue lines that go from the holding company, and then the green, the holding company owns the operational parents, and the operational parents own the subsidiaries. And in theory, every unit within that group is ascertainable because the holding company will own the shares of each of the operational companies, and it has to keep those records. And the operational company will own the shares of each of the subsidiaries in the level below it, because it has to keep those records and they have to be registered, and then so on down the chain. So it can be difficult when you're dealing with lots of jurisdictions to kind of find out necessarily who all those are. But in theory, it's a discrete unit. It operates by itself. It's one group, and in theory, at the top of the food chain, they know what every piece of, they have the sort of the tools to know what every other piece in the chain below them is doing. And in theory, outsiders can find that information out as well, because it's published. Companies have to be registered in a lot of jurisdictions. Annual reports often have to provide information on corporate groups and so on and so forth. So there are various reporting kind of tools out there that you can find out even just as a member of the general public. And then if you're a lawyer and you're litigating against companies, there are all kinds of ways in which you can find out the ownership of a corporate group like this, including through discovery. So if we go to the next slide, we can kind of compare that to a typical supply chain. And I've deliberately made this diagram similar to my first one, but you'll notice that I've changed the colors of the lines around. So this time, ownership isn't flowing. There is no ownership. The links here are contractual. So you might be a grocery incorporated in Canada, and you're going to have a relationship with what we call tier 1 suppliers. Those are the people with whom you contract. So that's our blue box at the top of the little chain there. And you might have, say you might have a contract with a soft drinks manufacturer to supply you with soft drinks that you put on your shelves. More likely, you'll have a contract with some kind of middleman, a distributor, and that distributor will then have suppliers who supply them. They're the tier 2 suppliers. But the important thing to note here is that those tier 2 suppliers don't have a contract with you, the ultimate buyer. They only have a contract with the tier 1 supplier they're supplying. And those tier 2 suppliers may in turn have their own suppliers of various things like components. Right, if you think of paint cans that you buy on the shelf of a big box store, the big box store might contract with a distributor who contracts with the paint manufacturer, who in turn contracts with the component manufacturers who build the can and the delivery system for that thing, but not the paint itself. So there's a whole array of people that go to make that. And as the products you're talking about get more complex, the supply chain gets more complex. So if we skip to the next one, we're beginning to see how a supply chain really differs from a corporate group here, because not only do you have that lack of a direct sort of ascertainable relationship, but no, it's not a case that your one tier 2 supplier supplies one tier 1 supplier who just supplies you, right? Each of those businesses will likely have an array of clients. So your tier 1 supplier might be supplying you, they might be supplying one of your near competitors, and they might be supplying someone completely different based in another geographical location. And then in turn, the tier 2 suppliers may be supplying multiple different people. So I've sort of put the links in there to sort of show how it quickly gets complex, right? Some of those tier 3 suppliers might be supplying different things to all of your tier 2 suppliers, who might be supplying different things to sort of 2 of your tier 1 suppliers who are both supplying you different things. And different people may act at different points in the chain at different times. So you might have a tier 1 supplier who supplies you directly with something, but they may also supply something else to one of your other tier 1 suppliers. So they're kind of a tier 1 and a tier 2 supplier in your ultimate chain, and you don't necessarily have great oversight over that. And that's the kind of the really key takeaway that I kind of want to emphasize about supply chains. All of these people might be in different jurisdictions. They might be operating with different laws, different regulations, different standards of conduct, different ways of doing business. And your ability as the ultimate buyer at the top of that value chain or that supply chain is to kind of ascertain who all those people are is much more difficult than in the case of kind of a typical corporate group. In some parts of the world, it's regarded as a trade secret who your sort of second tier suppliers are, right? It's the value add of the first tier supplier because they're the middleman that they want to protect they don't want to be cut out of the equation. So they're very reluctant to tell you who the people supplying them are, who are in your second and third tiers. And that's not the case everywhere, but it's certainly the case in some places. And that can make just finding out who is supplying you, let alone what their practices are, very difficult. So that's kind of the complex reality of what a supply chain can look like when it goes global. So if we go into the next slide, at this point, I think it's helpful to kind of consider what modern slavery is. So modern slavery is an umbrella term. And I've used the definition that's given by the Global Slavery Index, which is generally accepted. It covers sort of various different practices that are defined in different instruments. So it includes forced labor and child labor. It includes human trafficking, which is the recruitment, transportation, sequestration, harboring, and receipt of people. It includes other slavery-like practices like forced marriage and debt bondage. And there are kind of a number of red flags there that are often taken as kind of the markers of slavery that you may already be familiar with, like withholding wages or retaining identity documents, violence and threats. I'm conscious that I haven't got a lot of time, but if there's time at the end, I can tell you a little bit of some kind of personal stories about some of those red flags that I've come across in my practice. But if we go to the next slide, this again may be something you've seen before, given given the organization I'm talking to, but this is just to illustrate the scale of the problem of modern slavery worldwide. It was estimated in 2018 that there were 40.3 million slaves globally. Right, that's more than the population of Canada. Of that 43 million, somewhat under half, 15.4, is forced marriage, but 24.9, so nearly 25 million people, is forced labor. And of those 40.3 million, the total figure that includes forced marriage, it's estimated that around 17,000 are in Canada. And when it comes to for the breakdown for when we're talking about forced labor, which is important to supply chains in particular, it's including the sex. If we include the sex trade in that, then roughly 24% of that is sex trafficking. 76% of it is pure forced labor, and 25% of it is child labor. So, I mean, they're huge numbers. As soon as you start to think of them, they're really, really harrowing. And I've no doubt that the figures are bigger now. This is a 3-year-old. This is now 3 years old, this data. And every indicator that people who are familiar with this have seen shows that this is a problem that is growing almost exponentially. It's growing very fast for the simple reason that it's very profitable. So if we go to the next slide, why is modern slavery a supply chain problem? Well, it's not just a supply chain issue, right? There's sex trafficking. That's not really a supply chain issue as such, but it's kind of a discrete labor issue. There's domestic workers. Again, that's not something that tends to lead to a supply chain thing. There are a lot of people in conditions of modern slavery and domestic service worldwide, and that tends to be a one-on-one thing, right? It's quite small. And then there are sort of niche areas like the problem of child jockeys in the Middle East, where children are taken to ride animals because they're very small and light. Again, it's not really something to do with global value chains. But as the previous slides show, much of modern slavery is linked to the need for cheap labor or free labor and profit. And so it comes down to sweatshops, and it comes down to particular industries like fishing or low-wage manufacturing, areas where there's a lot of competition, or it's just an environment where it's easy to exploit people, and so people take advantage of that. And so that makes it really a supply chain issue, because where you have manufacturing, where you have any process that is involved in the production of goods, then the problems of those things can come up, right? As soon as your supply chains go global and you lose that kind of transparency and oversight that you might get in the more traditional business structure, it becomes very difficult to know what the practices are that are going on. In terms of recruiting people, in terms of training people, in terms of housing people, right? None of that is something that you necessarily have oversight of. And so that lack of transparency, coupled with kind of the local conditions that make modern slavery profitable or kind of easier to carry out, mean that it flourishes. Because it's precisely because it's difficult to combat. So if we move on to the next slide. So this is where I come to why it's difficult to combat. Now, as a lawyer, there are a number of really thorny issues in this area. They're not necessarily unique to supply chains. Some of them happen in corporate groups as well, but again, because of the complexity and the lack of transparency that you see in a supply chain, they're exacerbated in the supply chain context. So one problem is, right, there's in international law, the subjects of international law are states. So a company or a corporation doesn't have, isn't a legal person under international law. So there's no unifying global law that applies to help kind of combat modern slavery. If you take an international convention like the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, that has to be implemented by every state to pass laws locally that they then apply to the companies doing and people doing business in their jurisdiction. It's not something that that just has a sort of unique international character that all companies have to immediately abide by, no matter where they are in the world. So there's that problem of like a lack of international personhood for companies and corporations. There's a difficulty in what we lawyers call host state liability. So host state is the place where the conduct that's problematic, in this case forced labor, modern slavery, is taking place. Now, I've put three of them up there. I mean, I could spend an hour talking to you about the difficulties in host state liability by itself, but a lot of the ones that are common are there is a lack of sort of laws that designed to combat modern slavery in that jurisdiction. So that's what I'm calling regulatory underdevelopment. Or if there are laws, there's often a lack of enforcement. And that's something we see in the developed world as well. There might be corruption. So even though there are laws, and even though in theory there's corruption, people get bribed to not enforce it properly. And the final one is there might be all the things you need. There might be laws and law enforcement to back it up, but the company or the people who are there on the ground who might be held to account don't have any assets in the jurisdiction. That tends to be more of a problem of corporate groups, but it does apply in the supply chain context as well. So your local company, the one that's the problematic supplier that's enslaving people, they may not have any money in the jurisdiction. It may all be in a Swiss bank account. And the person with the deep pockets that you want to go after is the buyer who's based on the other side of the world, and that can be problem. It's difficult to hold that person to account in that country. On the other side, it's difficult to hold parent companies or buyers in the supply chain context liable in their home state. I could talk for an hour just about this. But for example, the US Supreme Court fairly recently, a few years ago, decided that something called the Alien Tort Statute, which gave people the right to sue a company for conduct committed abroad, didn't apply to companies unless they were US companies with a particularly tight connection and the conduct was happening in very kind of closely defined circumstances. So what everyone had thought gave as a statute that gave kind of victims of modern slavery and all kinds of other human rights abuses a right to sue before the courts, to sue parent companies before the courts of their home state, if their home state was the US, was shut down at a stroke. There's also kind of similar cases in the supply chain context. So I've put Doe and Walmart up there. Doe and Walmart was a supply chain case where Walmart had adopted a lot of rights to inspect some of its supplying facilities across the world, and it got sued by some workers from one of those facilities, and the court in question held that Walmart didn't owe them a duty, what's known as a duty of care, which is kind of a technical legal term for when you owe someone a duty outside of a contractual situation, and so they failed. And a lot of cases go that way because there isn't the requisite control between the buyer in the supply chain context and the workers of the second or third tier supplier. So I've already talked about kind of the exacerbation that supply chains cause in this example. The problem is the problem of the lack of transparency. So often buying companies at the top of the chain will say, well, we didn't know that this was going on. How could we possibly have known? We didn't know who our second and third tier suppliers were. And what's worse, our first tier suppliers wouldn't tell us when we asked. So that lack of transparency can be a real barrier to holding someone to account in a legal forum, because you need to be able to prove that they had some involvement in the action that you're trying to get a remedy for, because our civil liability is based on a concept of fault. One of the other kind of things that makes it more difficult in a supply chain context is, as compared to a corporate group, you can adopt a policy at the operational level or even the holding company level that flows down throughout the group. So every company below you has to respect that. It's not so easy to do that in a supply chain context. The equivalent is you put clauses in your contract with your first tier suppliers, and you make it obligatory for them to include the same clauses in their contracts with the second and third tiers. Those are what we call flow down clauses. It sounds great in theory, but in practice it doesn't work very well, because, well, it can work very well, but it's difficult to set up, because the only real opportunity you have to do it is when you're bringing a supplier in for the first time, or you're renegotiating their contract because it's come to an end. So you can't necessarily just insert this into an existing contract. And your first tier suppliers have the same problem. They can't immediately necessarily insert it into a contract they've already got going with a different supplier. So it can take time just to even get those clauses in there. And of course, these things have to be negotiated as part of your contractual negotiation, and not everyone's willing to sign on to that kind of enforcement and oversight. So in an ideal world, what we would have is we'd have very strong and powerful kind of contractual provisions that allow the buying company to both know who all the suppliers are down the chain, allow them to inspect those places, and also put in a number of kind of compliance and protection provisions to protect workers and affected communities in the areas where the goods are ultimately being produced, or the component goods are being produced, for example. But that doesn't happen because, as I said, it takes time. It's not necessarily an easy negotiation process. You have to go supplier by supplier, and just getting that oversight over the entire chain can be a challenging exercise in itself, and one that costs a lot of money and time. And then there's the problem of monitoring and enforcement. So once you've got your contractual clauses in place, well, then you need to know what's actually going on, which means you need to monitor it. So that can involve some quite costly and time-consuming processes. It depends very much on like the industry and the company and the size of the supply chain. There are definitely technological solutions coming along that can help with some of those things, but you essentially have to give yourself the ability to know what your entire supply chain looks like, and to go and kind of inspect it at any point in time, as well as sort of having regular checkups and audits and all the rest of it. And finally, there's the problem of enforcement, because then if you need to give yourself power as the private company, the buyer that's buying all of these, to do something about it when things go wrong. Otherwise, what's the point of your glorious kind of flow down clauses that give you the right to go and see what's going on? And that in itself can be a challenge as well, because the ultimate kind of power you have as a private company is to terminate the contractual relationship. There may be things below that. You may be able to provide for some sort of financial compensation provisions and other things, but ultimately the kind of nuclear option you have is to pull out of that supply relationship. Well, that can be fine in some cases, but in other cases the supplier may not care. You may be a fairly minor client of theirs, and they may have 3 other big clients who are still buying from them, so it doesn't change anything. And the other thing that can happen, of course, is that the opposite. You may be their biggest client. Your tier 1 supplier may give you 80% of their business, and 20% of their business comes from kind of small other people. And if you pull out, then you're going to put them and all of their sub-suppliers out of business. because you're terminating that relationship, and they won't be able to find anything that size within the time that it would take them to stay afloat. And there's plenty of kind of examples of that in the garment industry and in cases that have been brought, where you're often caught between that rock and a hard place of deciding whether or not to withdraw from a relationship, and thereby causing kind of a human rights disaster in itself, because you're putting hundreds or thousands of people out of a job, or staying in with the bad supplier and trying to get them to improve their practices.
Sorry, Benedict, just to give you your 5-minute warning. Just
okay.
You know. Thank you.
That's good. Well, I'm on my last 3 slides. So just that last bullet point on my governance gaps slide. The importance here is the 2 important things to note before I turn to a slightly more positive kind of thing. The importance here of leverage and drivers. So what I mean by leverage is the leverage that you have as a buying entity, or as a kind of tier 1 entity, or someone further up the value chain, to leverage that relationship and that power to kind of improve things further down the chain. So if you're in that example where you're the buyer who gives tier 1 80% of its business, which is the case with a lot of clothing companies, you do have a lot of power, and you can leverage that to kind of change the contractual machinery and to put some of those better practices into place. The other thing, though, that's important is drivers, right? And that's what's driving you, what's the incentive for you as this kind of large company that's a long way from the abuses that are taking place to kind of take it upon yourself, to assume those costs yourself, because all of this does generate cost, in order to sort of improve the lives of those people at the end. You'd think that it would be obvious, because you're going to improve the lives of those people and those communities, but it's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily work out as simply as that in practice. There are certainly companies which have kind of a positive corporate culture, and they do want to do the right thing, and they tend to be the early adopters of some of these sort of contractual clauses and the things we see, and the first to sort of adopt serious monitoring and compliance mechanisms before it's necessarily legally required. And there are kind of examples of Canadian companies that do that already, even though there's not necessarily the legislative need for it right now. Another driver that can be very important is investor pressure. So big financial investors like banks and hedge funds and pension funds, and all other kinds of kind of big institutional investors, they can be very important in improving the kind of supply chain practices of the people they're funding, provided, of course, that they themselves are incentivized. But they are becoming increasingly so. There are sort of movements within a lot of the investment communities that ESG and kind of business and human rights issues matter to them, and that can feed itself down to the kind of buying companies at the top of these chains. And then the third driver is regulation. If governments get involved and start passing laws like the ones I'm about to talk about, then that forces companies to start playing by the rules, and in some cases incentivizes them as well. So if we move to my next slide, how can we address the problem legally? There's kind of a palette of options that governments have, some of which are already being adopted around the world. There's a series of laws in the UK and Australia, and that are being proposed here in Canada, called Modern Slavery Acts, which target modern slavery in particular, and impose an obligation on companies at the top of the value chain to investigate what's happening in the supply chain and then publish an annual report about it. So they have to say what risks there are, what they're doing to identify those risks and further risks, and what they're doing to address those risks where they've identified them. So it's a sort of glorified naming and shaming. It can be, in some cases, like in Australia, it's backed up by potential criminal sanctions. It's not in the UK. It remains to be seen whether it will be here. Some of the bills that have been put forward have proposed it, but that's certainly something that can be done. And if you're in an industry where kind of your public reputation matters a lot, then that can be quite effective. A step further than that is what's called a mandatory due diligence law, which has been passed in France and the Netherlands. And that basically puts an obligation on a company to publish to come up with a due diligence plan that explains how they're going to investigate their supply chain or their operations, and then what they're going to do to address risks when they find them. And they have to update that plan again on an annual basis. And to back that up, the French law actually imposes civil liability on those companies. So if a risk, if one of these so-called risks kind of comes to pass and the human rights abuse occurs, the victims of that abuse can sue the parent company that's produced its due diligence plan if they haven't followed the plan in a suitable way. Other things that can be done are import-export controls and sanctions. So there's a series of laws that aim to tackle kind of what are called gross human rights violations, called the Sergei-Magnitsky laws. Those kind of come under Canada's sanctions regime and that of other countries. Import and export controls. So Canada just did this, in fact, in relation to Xinjiang in China and the problem of problem of abuse of Uyghurs there. So Canada has imposed an import ban on goods which are suspected of having been produced with forced labor in Xinjiang. So there is a whole series of enhanced due diligence that companies now have to carry out if they want to continue doing business with that specific part of China. The other sort of options that are being explored are kind of business and human rights arbitration as an alternative to home state and host state courts. We would establish some sort of international arbitration forum for the resolution of these disputes. That's very much in the early stages of development. There's an international team of experts that's proposed some arbitration rules, but we haven't got any arbitral institutions yet, and we're a long way from that becoming a reality. But it's certainly something that's being considered. And then there's what's called quasi-criminal enforcement, which is where you take something that's a criminal offense to do with human trafficking or slavery, and you impose civil orders related to that criminal conduct. So the example I've got here is brothel closure orders, which are something, they're part of the anti-slavery arsenal in the UK. And when I was a barrister there, I used to go around and close brothels. So where you'd proved that there was human trafficking going on in relation to sex work, you could the local police force and I think a few other public authorities could then apply to the court to close the property so that it couldn't be used for sex exploitation anymore. Now, how effective that is really an open question, because in that case, in one of the cases, I was acting for quite a small police force, and the resources they had to take care of the women who were being exploited and who were released from, who were kind of set free from the brothel afterwards was one officer. They had one officer who was devoted to, that was their modern slavery kind of counseling and aftercare. And it struck me at the time, it was going to be difficult for that one person to kind of act as the real kind of aftercare service for all of these things, because they're obviously just, this was a problem that was across their whole jurisdiction. So it wasn't something that concerned just one group of human traffickers. In fact, what happened is that the same people would often pop up again and again, and then the police would kind of chase them around, close the next one, try and get a few of the girls out and into some sort of freedom. But that can be difficult. If we go to the penultimate slide, do I still have time?
Sorry, we're just going to cut you off after this one. Is it okay if you let us post the slides so that people can see?
Sure.
We'll just be posting that in the Facebook event so that they can just look at that afterwards. We actually do have a few questions that we're hoping to ask you. You mentioned earlier that if you had time at the end, you would share some red flags of things that you noticed in your personal experience. Would you like to share those now? I think that would be just to get some better understanding.
So it's related to my brothel story, because one of the kind of red flags that's or the markers of modern slavery is the retention of identity documents. So a technique that's often used to coerce people into modern slavery and keeping them there is you take their identity documents or their passports and then you hold them against against their good behavior. And in my brothel closures example, I kind of got personal experience of that, because one of the things that emerged from that case, and which came out even in the courtroom when we had some of the women kind of testifying, was none of them had their identity documents on them. All of their identity documents, according to them, were being held safely for them by their auntie, who lived at a particular address in North London. And that's because that's the line that they're told to tell law enforcement. And it's striking when you do several of these cases and you get the same story every time. It's being held by my auntie, it's being held by my auntie. And of course, it's not being held by their auntie, it's being held by the human traffickers. And they're told, in the case of Britain, human trafficking for the sex trade is overwhelmingly from Eastern Europe. And it's not exclusively the case, but in general, people's ability to speak English is limited, and their level of education might not be particularly high. So they're also told by the human traffickers, who are far more sophisticated and have done this, a lot, that you can't tell the police, who you are or where you're from, because you're an illegal immigrant and you'll be deported, and so on and so forth. Now, a lot of what they're told isn't true, because there are specific legislative provisions in place against human trafficking designed to protect those people. And at one point asylum seeking was something that was facilitated if you could show you were a victim of human trafficking, and so on and so forth. But the retention of identity documents is an incredibly common tactic that's used in this area. It's not just in the sex trade; it's in forced labor more generally. I mean, it hit the news a few years ago because Qatar was making its bid for the World Cup in soccer, and you need an exit visa to leave Qatar if you're a migrant worker, and so your identity documents get held by your employer by law. So it's actually institutionalized there almost, and it's not necessarily the case that the law itself is creating modern slavery, but it's having a system like that in Qatar facilitates modern slavery enormously, because it makes it very easy for unscrupulous employers to keep people against their will and without wages, because they'll say, I won't let you leave the country. I can either keep paying you a pittance or nothing at all, and you can keep working for me, and maybe I'll release you in 6 months when the stadium's finished, and there's nothing that a worker can do in that situation to necessarily get it back. And so, in my little example that I gave of a smaller regional police force that had one officer devoted to kind of the dealing with the fallout from some of these enforcement actions, again, right, that's not a lot of resources to deal with these people, to help them recover their passports from someone whose address they may know, but who they may otherwise have very few identifying details for, their so-called auntie, who's probably, as soon as brothel A got shut down, has probably moved location. Right? It's very difficult to kind of to get the people out of that situation. They're very, very scared to talk to law enforcement because of the fear of being deported.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, your personal experience has been very helpful for us to kind of conceptualize that. So thank you for sharing. We had another question that is dealing more towards domestic versus international ways of resolving these issues. So the question is, do you see domestic level laws as being the most effective mechanism against slavery in the international context, or would looking towards international agreements / laws, despite their enforceability flaws, be a next step?
I think we need all of the above, really. I mean, I think when that slide that I put up with the sort of available options for legal solutions, and then the one that followed it about quasi-legal solutions, I mean, I think we need them all. This is an enormous problem that's only growing, and the resources that are currently sort of in place globally to fight it are like, they're tiny by comparison to the size of the modern slavery issue. So I mean, I think one of the most important things that I've learned is it's not necessarily there's a one size fits all solution. There's like there are a lot of ways that we can help to address this problem, and there are a lot of places we can do it from, right? So when you're thinking about how you spend your money, like, or how you invest your money, right? There are now a ton of options for kind of ethical investing, which are aimed at avoiding investing your money in areas where modern slavery might be a problem, as well as various other ethical issues like environmental problems. If you're looking at your careers, I mean, you can make a difference in this area from a lot of different places. For me as a lawyer, it's through helping companies adopt policies and compliance and monitoring mechanisms that help them gain that oversight over their supply chains, and then put in place the practices that are designed to kind of protect the end workers or the end affected communities. So some people might see me as kind of the bad guy because I represent kind of some of the big companies, but it's also the case that change needs to happen on the inside as well. So people who go into risk management, people who go into procurement, and kind of, or who work on or who are aiming at an executive career, in the C-suite of a corporation, those are all people with a lot of power to make a lot of changes in the supply chains that are going to supply their company. So it's not the case that you have to be a lawyer or a politician or kind of or a policeman to necessarily do something in this area, but those you certainly can do. But there are kind of opportunities everywhere you look. Local and provincial government, international development. I mean, again, that's another place where a lot of these practices, aiming to bring up the level of general development and education, which makes it more difficult for a lot of the ways that people get taken into modern slavery, making it more difficult for those to happen. That's something that happens through international development, compliance, right? Management consultancy, again, right? Those people often are helping look at what's inside a supply chain and where are the risk areas, geographic, sectoral, and so on. So there is quite a lot that can be done. It's just a question of thinking about how can I do this from where I am or where I want to go.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very good point. And yeah, I think we'll be talking about that with our next speaker on how we can do that as students, which I think is great. So just before we get to that, we have time for one more question. I'm going to cut you off at 8, so about 3 minutes to answer this last question, which I think will be a good one. It says, is the increased velocity of social media and quote unquote news hindering or helping this problem?
I don't know if I'm qualified to answer that. Yeah, it's a difficult one to say. Anecdotally, I think it's a little bit of both. I think that's something that depends on what area you're talking about, and kind of what the local forces at play are. Because you can often kind of provoke a kind of backlash through kind of shining, I wouldn't say shining a spotlight, but sort of acting too quickly to shine a spotlight on something can often provoke kind of the adverse reaction from the other side. People say, no, human rights isn't a problem. There's no systemic human rights problem here or whatever. So I think that, I think social media has been an enormous force for good, and it's a very powerful tool, including for the companies at the top of supply chains to know what's going on lower down, because they can often provide for mechanisms for, say, workers of 3rd and 4th tier suppliers to contact them through social media, for example, right? And the other way they do it is through smartphone apps and on hotlines and things like that. But social media has a lot of power to kind of to unmask things and to amplify the unmasking in a way that wasn't possible before with more traditional media. But it can also lead to kind of problems and battening down the hatches, right? I'm thinking again of that where you're in between a rock and a hard place because you've uncovered some terrible human rights violation, or it's been drawn to your attention, and your initial reaction as a company is going to be, well, okay, we're never doing business with these people again. And then you realize that by doing that, you're going to actually cause possibly even more widespread harm by putting a lot of people out of work. And it can be very difficult to navigate that in kind of the social media environment we live in. It can be very difficult to navigate that as a company. And so I think sometimes people do pull out when they should stay in, because if there was less of an immediate kind of backlash going on, they might spend some more time to kind of go in and fix it. But as I said, that's all kind of me speculating. That's not kind of the result of any kind of serious research or serious experience on my part, because yeah, I think social media mainly acts as an amplifier.
Thank you for your response, and thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting and informative for me, knowing very little about global supply chains, and it was summarized very well. So I thank you for your presentation and your words. I'm going to pass it off to Joyce now, who will be
Thanks very much.
Speaker. Yeah, thank you. You are free to stay for the next part of our presentation, or free to leave. Yeah, thank you from all of us here at IJM uOttawa.
All right, I think I just got hosting permissions. Big powers. Yeah, thank you so much, Benedict. It was really cool to like hear. I just recently graduated, so it was nice to like kind of be in a lecture kind of zone and listen to that type of stuff, something that I'm really interested in. So thank you so much for that, and thank you for your preparation as well. So yeah, up next for our second part of our presentation of our workshop, we have Tara Porter of Pokoloko, and then she's going to give us some practical tips of how to look for and purchase ethical products on a student budget, which I'm sure all of us are wondering about. How do we do that? And Tara is actually the social media and partnerships manager of Pokoloko. But what is Pokoloko, right? Pokoloko is an ethical business dedicated to promoting clothing and other items that were made sustainably. And so the business started after the owners, Jesse and Case, decided to bring back some handmade blankets from friends that they had met in Ecuador and to sell them in Ottawa, in the Ottawa Valley, actually. So this is very local to us. And then so since then, their dream of starting an ethical business has grown exponentially, with over 1,000 boutiques across North America in support of more than 100 artisan families in South America, Turkey, Morocco, and Indonesia. And also, fun fact, Pokoloko is also an environmentally friendly business because each time someone purchases from them, they plant 2 trees in the Pokoloko forest to offset CO2 emissions that have been accumulated in the process of sourcing material and creating and shipping their goods. And so Tara herself is an expert in managing small businesses, and she's actually been working for small businesses in Ottawa and the Hamilton area for the past decade. And so past experiences included, I don't know if you guys ever heard of Pure Kitchen, but she used to be the marketing director for them. Which Pure Kitchen was also their mandate. It was about encouraging the accessibility to plant-based food in everyday life and also in supporting local. And Tara is also a yoga teacher, and that's how she had met Jesse. And so Tara has always been an environmentalist at heart and a lover of supporting local initiatives. So we are so excited to have you here tonight, Tara. And so you will now have the ability to share your screen because you are also host. So you can share your presentation with us if you like. I will send you a personal message on Zoom at the 5-minute mark. And then at the end of this, guys, you guys will also have questions to be able to ask to Tara at the end. So feel free to send it to Q&A IJM account in our Zoom room. So the floor is yours, Tara. Thank you for coming and being here with us.
Thank you so much, Joyce. And thank you, Benedict. That was also really wonderful for me to see it and to hear your presentation about the supply chain just from a different avenue. So I'm just going to share my screen here. And I have a little presentation here for you. Let's see, backdrop there. All right, can you see that okay? Oh, I got a thumbs up. That's what I want. So what I would like to do today is I'm just going to share a little bit about Pokoloko, although Joyce, you just shared a really beautiful introduction there, so thank you for that. And then workshop out just a couple concepts that hopefully you can find accessible depending on your lifestyle, depending on your means, depending what's available to you, so that we can collectively make ethical consumption easy. I also want to talk about circular fashion and slow fashion a little bit as well. So I started with this photo here. This is one of our Turkish artisans. And there's a really wonderful organization called Fashion Revolution. And they started this hashtag of I Made Your Clothes. So it's a global conversation. I recommend checking out what they do and the resources that they share about just breaking down a little bit more about, hey, you may be wearing this piece of clothing that you don't think twice about, but you know what's weaved into those threads and behind it there. So we went a little too far. So Pokoloko, I hear a lot of interesting attempts to sometimes say Pokoloko. Pokoloko comes from the Spanish phrase poco loco, meaning a little bit crazy. Poco loco. And as Joyce had touched on, this is what our Ecuadorian artisan partners used to call Jesse and Case. And this was when Pokoloko didn't even really have the name. So it started off with them selling those blankets in the Ottawa Valley. And they were selling those blankets out of the back of Case's old Volkswagen Jetta, which had like a gold stick shift back in 2014. So this has been developing now for about 7 years. And it did seem a little bit like a crazy thing that they were doing. They really had a drive for travel, both individually and collectively. So Jesse and Case are co-founders and business partners, as well as life partners. And as the organization has been evolving, starting first just as a wholesale provider, and now actually having an online store, and we opened up a shop in October in Westboro. They love that name because it really just allows us to think outside the box, doing what you love, never stop adventuring, but also, you know, staying true to what you're doing. So these photos here, this is Case, the founder, with Hector. So Hector and Estella are the couple that Jesse and Case met in Ecuador. And Case was traveling, and I'll talk a little bit more about Case momentarily. And when they first met in 2014, Hector and Estella were living with Hector's parents. This is in the foothills of the Andes Mountains. And Hector had learned the craft of weaving and blending alpaca fibers from his father, and they had a singular loom there. So this is where they got these blankets and these beautiful scarves from, took them back, and were selling them out of the back of their Jetta that way. So this is Estella, and they're both about the same age as Jesse and Case. We're in our mid-30s, and are both natural entrepreneurs, just like Jesse and Case. So we've been able to scale their business alongside them. So when they went back to ordering more and more and now more and more, that's where Pokoloko came from. And we were able to give them loan to a micro loan so that they could actually buy their own property and purchase a machine, which would have otherwise been a very costly investment, so that they could scale their business alongside our business scaling as well. So they are super lovely. So a little bit about Case and Jesse, just to give you an idea of mindset and that entrepreneurial mindset. So Case's family, I don't know if you've ever heard of the One World Bazaar. It's previously dubbed the Third World Bazaar in Manotick. So his uncle started that, and they travel and connect with small scale artisans around the globe, and then bring back in that fair trade model all of their wares and sell them once a year. So he was always around that concept of supporting artisans and being an artist himself. Both Case and Jesse are musicians. And so that definitely had a really big impact on this development. Like part of the reason why he was in Ecuador when he met Hector and Estella was to source some new artisans for the One World Bazaar. And Jesse had also been working for a couple nonprofit NGOs globally. She was working in Nicaragua. So that fusion of their mutual love and sort of non-negotiable element of having fair trade practices was just a unifiable way for them to build upon that and to grow Pokoloko a little bit more. So some of the things that are non-negotiables, and when we're designing and creating and our mission as we evolve, is the carbon neutral shipping. This is something that there's actually a UK-based company called Ecology, ECOLOGI, where they actually have an application. So they make it really accessible for businesses, especially small businesses or larger or medium scale businesses, to help offset their carbon emissions. And they also have a bunch of different platforms and different partnerships separate from just tree planting. So that's one way that it's been really easy to integrate and to offset our carbon emissions from the process of procuring and as well as selling and shipping the products as well. Artisan made, it's really important that we know the people who are making the products for us. And that is also a differentiator for us as a small or medium scale business. Fair trade principles, fair trade organizations, Fair Trade Canada, there's that regulation of ensuring that both the social and environmental practices are non-negotiable in the way that they're procuring, that the price of the product, and that also that environmental factors is a really big one with fair trade practices, to ensure that it's also not disrupting that area, as we know that when folk are more vulnerable, there's a lot more room for that to be taken advantage of. And even within fair trade business practices, maybe you're familiar with the term of greenwashing. For example, if it is unfamiliar to you, maybe you've seen at the grocery store something that's like, it's a healthy product, and they have like organic cane sugar, and the rest of it is ingredients that you can't, marketers have realized, okay, if people are really trending towards more transparency because, it's right now it's a privilege to support sustainable practices. However, we can't really afford to have that scale be in that direction. So fair trade practices are a really great way to start tipping that scale a little bit. Ethically sourced. So this, we're talking both from the actual materials that they're using to make the products that we sell, as well as what is the quality of life of the folk who are making it and their families as well, and in their communities, and the purpose purchase. So this is something that we could say capacity development in that way. So with the story of Hector and Estella, we were actually able to see the impact that has within their community. So there's a lot of purpose behind what's behind that, and cruelty free as well. So moving on, chatting about slow fashion here. So I love these two quotes. Fast fashion is not free. Someone somewhere is paying for it. And this, I really loved, Benedict, what you're talking about, the supply chain in that way. That exploitation is, who knows who made this shirt that you have? Like, were they exploited? What is the transparency that's there? So because sometimes it is more of a privilege, or it's maybe less accessible right now in the buying market to support sustainable, it doesn't, it's that fine line between balancing ethical consumption and also the needs of where you are. So we'll get into that shortly, and we'll break that apart a little bit more, because chances are if something is really, really cheap, someone is paying for it. There's exploitation somewhere. 75% of fashion supply chain materials end up in landfills. So this is talking about fast fashion in that way. So fast fashion is where they're wanting to create more and more products so that with our ever decreasing attention span, we're staying on trend, and they're hoping to do cheap and fast and to sell a lot, versus the slow fashion model or mentality, where there are fewer collections and it's intentional, and the material and the design is also sustainably thought of and created as well. So they're more expensive potentially at first glance, and how we perceive value in something, that the way that we educate ourselves can help to change that. But ultimately, we are each going to have our own way that we perceive the value of something. So yes, it may be more expensive up front, but chances are, because it is made in a sustainable quality design way, it's going to far outlive the lifespan of that cheaper in the meantime product. Now, as I'm saying all this, there is time to go and get that thing that's cheaper, and there is a time to get something that is a little bit more expensive. So I think it's also really important to touch on that. Accessibility there's definitely a pain point in accessibility to sustainably made things, and sometimes the prices of it, and sometimes that's in tandem with educating ourselves on what's behind that product. So on the concept of circular fashion, this is something where there's circular, you can think about circular economy. There's like recyclable economy, and then there's like that fast fashion. So it's circular. The intention is that you're starting with sustainable materials. So the irony is I'm not putting this in a circle, I'm putting it in a pillar for you here. So it's these sustainable materials. So that's taking into consideration what the actual materials are made of, what is their sourcing process like, how disruptive is that to the environment, but also what's the longevity of these materials. Then those are made into products designed to be versatile and designed to last. So versatility is something that's really important as we think about design, as well as the quality of the products that we're making, so that we're not adding to that landfill stat. And then from that point, you're wearing it with care. There's often a story behind it. There's value. You have this attachment. There's that exchange of money is energy. There's that exchange of that energy. And then, maybe it comes a time that the best before date is up, or you're sort of over it, or then you can pass it on, or you can loan it, or have an exchange. And there's this refreshed energy in your closet, and in that realm as well. Repaired, and then we go to repair or recycle. So with repairing and with recycling, it's also really, I pressed the button accidentally here. This is something that we forget. We see a hole in a sock and we throw it out. We find a hole in a pair of clothes and we throw it out. Sometimes that's inevitable. In your jeans, maybe the crotch is that's a common thing that goes, or the thighs. So what way can we think about certain things that allow you to mend it, to maybe then take that broken fabric, turn it into something else, so you're upcycling it, so you're giving it a new sense of value. Or when it's done, recycle, compost when it's complete, because those materials that it's made with are sustainably sourced. So I have a picture here of a mask. This is our first Canadian-made product. And what happened is we had received these kimonos from a manufacturer, and they had scaled their business, and unfortunately the sizing guide was off. So we'd had like pre-orders for these gorgeous kimonos or dusters. I've recently learned that that's a better term for those. So we were like, what are we going to do with all this fabric? So major corporations, to not devalue the brand or the product or to pass them on. They'll often destroy them and add them to landfills. So we were like, hey, let's make some face masks with these. So that's an example of how businesses can also, like, let's say we weren't going to make face masks out of those. That would be an opportunity for us to maybe reach out to another local maker, someone who makes scrunchies or someone who makes, dog bandanas or something, so that we are also helping to divert landfill waste as well. So where to start? Integration options for you here. So I've got about 9 different options for you here. Feel free to take notes. One thing to keep in mind if you are working on it with the budget is sometimes that means planning in advance. So let's say we're working toward thinking about gifting something to someone else. If there's an event, this is where we can start to plan in advance, both with our finances so that we're sort of squirreling away what we need to, so that we know, okay, maybe I won't be buying as much, but maybe it'll have a higher price point. And you're planning for that in advance. For yourself, same thing. So looking at your budgets and establishing, okay, this is how much that I'm willing to spend on myself. And that could be monthly, that could be quarterly. So planning in advance, it does take a little bit of that forethought sometimes to really be conscious and mindful about your spending and where you're spending in that way. Starting local. So the beauty about supporting local and local businesses is a lot of the time they're supporting other local businesses. So there's the economical impact of that, there's the environmental impact of that. And sometimes some of these local products or gifts are actually even made with Canadian or Ontario or Ottawa based ingredients as well. So that is another way that you can really support, you have so much power with your dollar that where you put that makes a big difference. So again, how do we perceive value? Is the value that we want to buy more so that it stretches more, or do we want to buy something with more quality or with meaning that maybe and hopefully should last a little bit longer too? And the other thing about local, one other environmental and mental health and self-care thing is that there's going to be a personal connection. You're also establishing this relationship with folk and members in your community. And a lot of local businesses are walking destinations. So there's that physiological effect of that as well. So all sorts of wonderful things that you can do there. This is very accessible. And then I wrote subscribe here. That could be subscribe, that could be follow. We're talking about social media. It's a double-edged sword. It perpetuates dominant discourses. And sometimes those are negative and sometimes those are positive. It depends on who you're talking to, how they will define those. The benefit of subscribing to small businesses and other businesses or following them on social media is that you'll be privy to exclusive promotions. A lot of, as if you ever work in small business, if you ever own a business or have worked for someone, this is what the business owns. The email lists are their true community. And so they'll often treat that true and that loyal and that recurrent community and that warm audience appropriately. So this is an opportunity to maybe, yes, 9 times out of 10, if you're like, oh my gosh, my inbox is overladen with all of these newsletters. So be intentional about who you subscribe to, but do subscribe, because that might be an accessibility point for something that 15% off to make it a little bit more financially accessible to you as well. Moving on. Buy less. There's a quote by Vivienne Westwood, and it's buy less, choose well, use it often. So we are shown all the time on all the media platforms that we need more to be happy. So this really challenges that concept of being intentional about your purchases. So do you really need it? Can you buy less, but can you use it in a bunch of different ways? Is there versatility? This comes back to that slow fashion, sustainable, circular fashion model of, okay, I only need this one thing, but I can use it a bunch of different ways. So those mesh eco bags, which you see here, yes, you can use them for produce, but you can use them when you're packing. You can use them in your book bag. You can use them in your laundry. You can use them as a dish rag when you're camping after you've used the produce that you've carried in it. The Turkish towels that we make, yes, they're a towel and many people use them as towels, but I wear it as a scarf in the winter, and then I use it as a tablecloth. And then when I'm on my road trips, it's my everything. So it's one thing, but then I get so many different uses out of it. And do you really need that extra thing? Are you chasing happiness in that way? So that's a bigger esoteric question, and I won't get into that. Reading the labels, so this comes back to understanding where the product is made, or this will often give insights of what the materials are made from. So you can also be aware of, okay, this has a lot of plastics in it, or this has fill in the blank in it. Whenever I go grocery shopping, I'm also sometimes taking into account, okay, this is made in Mexico, but this is made in California, but it's wrapped in plastic. So it's, like sometimes it's choosing the lesser evil, and I'm going to use that word very loosely. Again, it's not without, I think it's really important to approach this in a compassionate way, because it can be really overwhelming if you really get into the nitty gritty of all of these things. But that goes also to in that same thought pattern of, okay, do you know where your clothes comes from? Do you know where this product comes from? And that environmental economic fusion of that inquiry is really powerful. And again, your purchase power comes through there. Find out what's possible, ask. So some businesses have ways, because they understand sustainable businesses, that it's a privilege right now. And so this is something, we have something called pay bright. It's like layaway, so that if you know that you want to make that intentional purchase, but $140 for this blanket is not accessible right now, that's the planning in advance thing, where you can break it down into different payments without any extra interest fee on top of it. So a lot of businesses are hopping on board with PayBright. We'll see that with some of our other inspiring ethical brands that inspire us. But then you can always ask, send a DM on Instagram or an email, like, hey, when is your next sale happening? Are there any promotions I should be aware of? Most folk will really love to chat with you and hear from you. And you really never know unless you ask. So that's an important one. I really like this photo of our alpacas in Peru, because they look like they're having a conversation there. With capsule wardrobes, maybe you've heard of this. So this is something where, again, we're drawing in that intention of circular and slow fashion, where every piece is practical and where every piece can sort of work with one another. So you don't need a million things, but you have your fewer things. You can read a little bit more about this. Marie Kondo really sort of brought that forward, this capsule wardrobe idea, and taking it outside of just wardrobes and thinking about also your, oh, there we go. My 5-minute warning. You can also think about it in a way that can be in your home, or you can think of it seasonally. So not just wardrobe, but what about your home decor, and what about your outerwear, and what about what you have anywhere in your house? How can you apply that same way of thinking for it? So that goes into buy less, that goes into be intentional, planning in advance, get crafty. So that's on the mending. So maybe one thing that you need to do when you think, oh, I wish I had this, is falling back in love, really taking inventory of what you have and seeing what you can do. Does it mean that you need to brush off your needle and your thread? Does it mean watching a couple YouTube videos to figure out how you can mend this or repurpose what you already have? Maybe that's going to fill a void of something that you want. And again, we have that. There's a lot of really powerful mental health benefits from also doing that. We're feeling purposeful, we're getting into that flow state, we're creating something. So this is also something that's really powerful and also helps you repurpose what you have on a budget. This is super, super important. And then being an ambassador. So many of you are so creative. I don't know you, but I'm sure of it. And many businesses, this may be an accessibility point, may be open to content creation, or maybe you're someone who wants to, welcome this business or this organization in. So like, use your resources, use your community, use asking, so that maybe there's some sort of energy exchange. Maybe you're going to work for that place that you're really admiring and you get a discount for it. Maybe there's an energy exchange in content creation and you're helping to be an ambassador for this bigger conversation. And, in return, you're getting product. Or maybe you're helping to spread the word, focusing again on the values, and there's a discount too. So this is something that is really accessible. Sometimes the word influencer may be like, oh, I don't want to do that. Think of it as collaboration, and think of it as a way of what are the values behind that business? How can it spark a bigger conversation? And that's really how I like to approach marketing. I would hate to ever greenwash. I would hate to lead folk to buy. At the end of the day, we're selling fabric and textiles, but really what's important to me is the end of really knowing where things are coming from. So let's put it in practice. This is my almost last slide here. What is accessible to you? It's important to start where you are and to think of making changes that are equally slow and sustainable. So without approaching this like fast, like gotta get it mentality, how can you abide and adopt and integrate these changes in a way that is also sustainable? So makeup is one thing that maybe 8 or 9 years ago, I wanted to do a full makeup audit. And so if anyone else uses makeup, it's expensive. So it's like one piece at a time is what you do. Same thing with clothing. I'm a huge thrifter. And that's one thing that I actually didn't talk about. Thrifting and recycling clothes swaps. That's a huge way that you can support ethical consumption. You're diverting clothing from the landfill. You're giving it a second life. So that's one really accessible way that you can also build your closet and support ethical consumption. But what are realistic and sustainable for you to adopt in your lifestyle that way? And Sissa, use this code. I'd originally thrown in a gratuitous Y. So IJM, you can save 15% until March 31st, if that ever interests you. And I'm going to stop sharing this here. And I'm going to stop sharing this here. And I'm ready for all of the questions. And now I need to make.
Sweet. Thank you so much, Tara. Yeah, are you able to make Sinead host again for us?
Yeah.
Thank you. I think you made it right on the 30 minutes too. That's perfect.
I was just watching. Go. Start there.
Thank you. And especially like the 9 little tips that you gave. It was excellent. Thank you so much. All right, so we did get a few questions. So the first question is, do you think we'll ever achieve a fully circular economy? Do you think we should be striving for or ever will achieve this growth? Sorry, I think typos in the way I posted that. Copied it.
That's a great question. Oh, I mean, I obviously know all the answers to this, but I'd like to think that, and from what we see from statistics, from purchasing habits, that there is an increase in that trend, and that hopefully won't be a trend. Right now it's being dubbed a trend, and it's almost like we're returning back to a way of being that was very present before. So I think that sometimes these really big changes will come out of necessity, and sometimes these changes will come out of continued education and continued conversation. So I'd like to see that it doesn't become a trend, but becomes more of a way of being. And I definitely see from both social and marketing stats and also from purchasing stats that there is an increase in that direction. So hopefully that answers a little bit to your question.
I did not unmute myself. It does. And it also is it's very hopeful too. So thank you for answering that question. Second question. Someone said, I believe you mentioned UK supports. I think that was like the first or second slide. You're talking about the carbon
Ecology?
Yeah, ecology. But the question is, but are there any supports that exist to help support Canadian businesses to achieve carbon neutrality?
So ecology is set up to support worldwide. So they have actually set up their infrastructure. They're really, I'm gonna give you their, it's writing in the chat what the name of that company, that business is. We really admire this company because they're so transparent. So they're so transparent about only having a small team of workers so that the money for labor and for salaries is minimal and is really diverted into the different partnerships and education that they're doing. So they've infiltrated within anyone who has a Shopify store, no matter where you are, can actually integrate ecology within their carbon neutral goals and practices that way. So ecology is really great. They're just growing more and more and more. And then in terms of other carbon neutral organizations within Canada, unfortunately, I can't think of any off the top of my head. I'm like, wish Case were here, the co-founder. He would probably pipe in with something that and be like, well, there's actually this place. But I think that that's partially why he went with ecology, as there are fewer organizations that are actually providing that access. And one thing that I've really noticed, having managed small businesses for so long, is that small businesses are different from major corporations where you're wearing a million different hats at any given time. So even as the business scales, you grow slightly and readjust the hats. So these different organizations, or these, I'll call them plugins in that way, they maybe aren't always aware of that accessibility point. Like, it really needs to be accessible for business owners to adopt. However, I think it's a really important thing. You see more business owners with their carbon awareness, with their packaging choices or how they're shipping things. But there's so much more than just choosing craft paper versus the financial way that you can support it. There is an organization called B Corp, and they are more of like a regulatory body that is a really high functioning body, like in order for you to be fair trade certified, or my friend and I were talking about wine earlier, about like to get VQA certified in Ontario. It's a very expensive process to get that certified accreditation. So B Corp is sort of like a step above to have that really conscious stamp of approval showing all of your different practices that way.
Awesome, thank you. We're gonna do one last question. Okay, so sorry, there's like kind of two parts to this question. But so it says, while many large businesses do not have a reputation for having ethical supply chains, as we have seen throughout the evening, how would you suggest we tackle the issue of the regular people who are working for these companies and also need to make a living? Is boycotting businesses that have unethical means of production harmful to these workers just trying to support their families?
That's a great question. I feel like Benedict also touched on that when he was talking about, like, okay, how do you call on these folk and completely take away all of these jobs from I feel like this is a Benedict question too. This, I think that comes back to a combination of things. That combination of, there's always a time and a place where you're going to go to Walmart and you're going to do this, and some could say that it's more harmful to carry around that guilt or that shame as you're going through that, if that is just what is available to you in that moment. So I think it's also really important to know that there'll always be a time and a place. And I think it's also really important to be kind and compassionate that way. That's my own personal opinion of that. But one thing that you can really do for those bigger corporations is to put your power to paper, or to email the folk, to email the corporations, to show on social media that they probably have a PR team, but they don't want to see that. They don't want to be able, and that's the double-edged sword of social media, that if there are questionable practices, they do not want to have a storm of people who are sort of shining a light on maybe that dust in the corner that they're trying to hide. So I think that, it is important to still be supporting these folk. And I think that's just like such a multi-angle, deep question that looks at both our social services, that looks at our educational services, that looks at systemic racism, that looks at, there's a lot wrapped up into that question. So I think my biggest takeaway from that is, put your power in your word, call them out, ask them to, and do it in a way that can really make movement. So it's not always so reactive. Where is their power into it? And how can you really rally in a way that isn't overly reactive, but is sustainable as well?
Sweet. Thank you so much, Tara. Thank you very much for coming out and speaking on this for us and answering our questions. Thank you. As I was asking this question, I think also we would like to ask this last question that I just asked Tara, to Benedict as well. And so Benedict, I'm gonna toss the mic over to you. I'm gonna just repeat the last third question again. So, is boycotting businesses that have unethical means of production harmful to these workers just trying to support their families?
So, I mean, I think my kind of takeaway from what Tara said was, there's a time and a place. And I think that's really good. That's a really good way of looking at this whole problem, because, right, I mean, if we look at the garment industry and the practices that were uncovered in the 90s and the early 2000s, there were huge boycotts in those times, and a big kind of light was shone on a lot of bad practices by those boycotts and those protests and that public discourse. So there's definitely a place for public discourse, but there's a place for all the other things as well. And I think, if I wanted to kind of offer a kind of a hopeful message, it's that, and I was thinking of this while Tara was talking about ecology in the UK and kind of how things are sort of progressing. But, I think it's sort of fair to say that some of these issues were a little bit behind Europe here in North America. And as someone who kind of grew up with those boycotts in the 90s and 2000s, and then went away and kind of studied this in Europe and then came to North America, I was kind of struck, and this is purely anecdotal, but I was just struck when I went on my visits back to the UK before the pandemic ruined travel, by how much progress there's been in the 5 years that I'd been living in Canada. and how much, like, so all of these things have a place. Regulatory oversight has a place, boycotts have a place, purchasing practices have a place, investor kind of interest has a place. And I think it's, as Tara said, it's just important to be mindful of how you're going about things and whether it's the most effective means. But sometimes it might be the only means, right? Sometimes the choice you have is, I stop buying this product and I'm silent, or I stop buying this product and I say something. And there might not be an alternative in that particular scenario. Or it might be an industry where you don't have any consumer power because it's it's some investigative journalist has kind of uncovered some practices in a sector that sells to businesses, and that you as a consumer have no sort of power to prevent directly. But you say it's kind of speaking up and making sure that story gets more traction can be effective. And yeah, my message of hope is, change can come and change will come. And the important thing is to get the groundswell going that will keep things moving forward.
Thank you so much, Benedict, for also answering that question. Thank you. And thank you, Tara, again. Again, thank you both for coming out tonight and for teaching us. I'm going to hand over the mic to Jenna with some closing remarks.
Wow, just thank you so much, guys. That was absolutely fantastic. I'm just gonna start a little round of applause. Everyone throw one in there. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. I was really struck, especially by both of your nuance in approaching the why, the theoretical side of it, Benedict, and then the nuance that you carried over as well, Tara, in explaining how do we respond. I thought that it was, you both understand like the extremes of it all and like the gravity of it all, but are also really realist and like practical. And so I have found this very, very helpful. I especially really enjoyed your explanation of the complexities of the solutions, Benedict, and Tara particularly. I really, I loved the fact that you were so reflective in a lot of your suggestions. Like, you don't want us to just blindly do all of these things. You are really driving home that we should be thinking really mindfully about where we're spending our money and where we're spending our time. And so thank you so much. This has been absolutely fantastic. Okay, first things first, let's do the giveaway. So I did make sure to keep track of everyone who came through here. And the winner of the first prize bundle, which is the bags and the bamboo straws, is Mandy Hui. And the winner of the second bundle is Brandon. And so congrats, guys. We will be in touch with you on how to get those things to you. I don't know if both of you are in Ottawa, but we'll be able to drop them off or ship them to you. And I just wanted to plug a few of the things that IJM uOttawa has coming up. The biggest thing that we have coming up is actually a virtual conference on March 19th and 20th, which is coming up very fast.